Venezuela's economic crisis. Does it mean that the left is failed? Second, hard energy subsidies can be lifted more gradually over the next 18 months. To make it economically and politically acceptable, additional government revenues will be added to targetas when energy prices are allowed to rise. This will be a net gain for the vast majority of Venezuelans. Some price controls, including those that did not allow producers to cover their costs, will be phased out. Other measures to protect people's standard of living include indexing wages to inflation and creating the temporary public works program to create employment. They can be financed by a tax for wealth similar to the wealth tax in Colombia and a tax for financial transactions. The government can help finance the transition by selling some of its foreign assets. At the same time, the debts will need to be restructured in order to reduce debts of $17 billion, which should be paid in the next 1.5 years. All of this can be done with existing oil prices, because Venezuela has adjusted its import level to match the fall in oil prices, which has helped to account for more than 90% of the country's dollar gains. It was a very big setup. Import has fallen more than half since 2012. For comparison, Greece reduced imports by 28% after more than 6 years of depression. This is already a difficult part of tuning, already requiring people to reduce their living standards in order to sharply reduce their imports. The relative prices that need to be adjusted to improve are now. The result is that Venezuela is growing very quickly, without long-term stagnation normally created by neoliberal adjustment. Left theses of proposed economic reforms. Most of the leftists, including the head of the government and the party, PSUV, have rejected these economic reforms. They think it is a package similar to the IMF, or neoliberal reforms that have increased poverty in the past. They regard fixed exchange rate as a free market reform as a socialist and floating exchange rate. But in reality, the informal dollar economy is one of the most devastating free markets available. Capitalism salvaged by Hugo Chavez. Let us recall that the IMF supported stable, overvalued exchange rates with disastrous consequences in Argentina, Brazil, Russia and a series of Asian countries in the last years of the 20th century. There is no neoliberalism with a government-created program that protects wages from inflation, subsidizes food and basic items in large quantities, and people are generally burdened with setting relative prices. But on the left, there are people who think that Venezuela can recover without the most basic and destructive imbalances. Alfredo Serrano, the government advisor, published 8 economic theses in Venezuela on September 1. In 2,700 words, Venezuela's dysfunctional exchange rate system has not been promised. At the same time, the U.S. government, seeking regime change for the last 15 years in Venezuela, has been trying to make the economy even more unstable. In March 2016, President Obama once again said that Venezuela is an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and sanctions are imposed. Sanctions send a message to investors to know what they are, not economically important but what is called the extraordinary threat for the United States. Obama administration is pressuring U.S. financial institutions not to do business with Venezuela. International media and everyday resources have played a traditional role, and some widely reported stories have been wrong. By 2015 there were widespread reports that the rate of poverty rose to 76% when it was almost impossible. The IMF, which has a long history of influencing estimates of the policies, predicted that GDP would decrease by 10% last year while the actual figure was 5.7%. The media is predicting that the IMF will predict 720% of inflation this year, but it is likely. The proof of the media's extreme hostility to the Venezuelan government. Many journalists feel the need to exaggerate Venezuela even when it faces the biggest economic crisis of decades. However, even in the majority of the economic boom between 2003 and 2008, employment grew rapidly and poverty was declining, and it was difficult to find positive things about Venezuela in the mass media.